I am not the kind of democratic socialist who accentuates the cleavage between democratic socialism and social democracy. At least social democracy achieves universal health care and solidarity wage policies. But I do believe that social democratic parties and movements lose their soul when they don't fight for new and old forms of economic democracy.
Welcome. We are so glad you're here, and we're anticipating a wonderful evening. In a few moments, you'll be introduced to Professor Gary Dorrien, and I want to say just in advance that we're in for an evocative lecture and a generative conversation. So put your seatbelts on. I also want to give thanks to the Lowell Institute for its generous support of these events. And my comment is not perfunctory, because the Lowell lectures are an anchor for us every single year. And the Lowell Institute sponsors public conversations all over the Boston region, encouraging people to come together and talk about subjects that are important to address, subjects of all kinds. So the Lowell Institute supports conversations, lectures, panels, conferences in many institutions around the Boston region. And we're very, very fortunate that they've been generous supporters of our Lowell lecture. Now I have the privilege of introducing you to Felipe Maya. And this will be a brief but heartfelt introduction because we are so glad that you're here. You have already brought enormous gifts to this community. Dr. Maya is one of our two newest professors. The other one is sitting right here on the front row, Luis Menendez Antuña. And Felipe is assistant professor of theology with specialties in finance, future, hope, drawing richly from the Latin American theological and philosophical traditions. He's already bringing a richness that we are hungry for, and we're very grateful. He also is a former student, mentee, and teaching fellow for Professor Gary Dorrien. So his introduction of Gary Dorrien will be special.
Good evening, everyone, and thanks, Dean Moore, for introducing the introducer. This is my task today, so welcome all of you to the Lowell lecture this evening. It is my pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Gary Dorrien, who is the Reinhold Niebuhr Professor of Social Ethics at Union Theological Seminary and Professor of Religion at Columbia University. Professor Dorrien teaches social ethics, theology, and philosophy of religion. He's the author of 19 books and more than 300 articles that range across the fields, and this will be a long list, okay? So pay attention to them. The fields of social ethics, philosophy, theology, political economy, social and political theory, religious history, cultural criticism, and intellectual history. Philosopher Cornel West describes him as the preeminent social ethicist in North America today. STH Professor Emeritus Robert Neville calls him, quote, the most rigorous theological historian of our time, someone who is able to move from analysis of social context and personal struggles through the most abstruse theological and metaphysical issues, end quote. On top of all of that, Professor Dorrien is also an ordained priest in the Episcopal Church. Gary Dorrien is on sabbatical from Union Theological Seminary this fall, which allows him to join us at BU School of Theology as the visiting professor of social ethics. He is teaching this fall Black Social Gospel and Social Ethics in the Making, both primary areas of his expertise and also areas he has explored in some of his most recent publications, namely, The New Abolition, W.B. Du Bois and the Black Social Gospel, published in 2015, Breaking White Supremacy, Martin Luther King Jr. and the Black Social Gospel, published in 2018, and more recently, Social Democracy in the Making, Political and Religious Roots of European Socialism, published this year, 2019. In fact, this last book, I'm told, will soon get a sequel as Gary crosses the Atlantic to address the history and the legacy of democratic socialism in the United States. Also, Gary's newest book, the one that is coming next, should be out soon, and it's called In a Post-Hegelian Spirit, Philosophical Theology as Idealistic Discontent. I must say one thing that Dean Moore already advanced, that oftentimes is obscured by Gary Dorrien's outstanding and more than impressive publication record. And that is symbolized by the fact that Gary's latest book is dedicated to his doctoral advisees, with gratitude and affection, he says. Though Gary was not one of my advisors directly, I and a multitude of young and emerging scholars have benefited greatly from this affection that we get from him. In fall of 2013 and spring of 14, I worked as Gary Dorrien's teaching fellow, doing his previous sabbatical, and have ever since benefited from his mentorship and guidance, something that in many ways has brought me to this place. So make no mistake about this, Professor Gary Dorrien is one of the most outstanding theologians, social ethicists, and historians of our time. But he is also a fine mentor, a kind presence, and an advocate whose leadership is creating the conditions for the rise of a new generation of scholars and justice seekers. And for that, I want to express my sincere gratitude. The title of Gary Dorrien's lecture tonight is The Social Gospel in Black and White, Imagining Economic Democracy, Breaking White Supremacy. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Gary Dorrien.
Thank you, Felipe, for that generous and kind introduction. I am deeply grateful to be here, to be giving this lecture tonight. This school has been in my head and heart for a long time. It's splashed all over my scholarship, especially a trilogy I wrote on theological liberalism a few years ago. All 3 volumes of that book, BU, is just all over it. There are all kinds of things I just love about this place, and I've also imagined about it over the years that I'm now sort of learning more about as I'm here this fall. I have long admired Dean Moore's superb stewardship of this school, and am so grateful that I got to be here during what is turning out to be her farewell year. And I have a bunch of friends on this faculty, especially Dean Moore, Walter Fluker, also sadly in his farewell year, Chris Evans, Wes Wildman, the recently retired Robert Neville, and Felipe. As you just heard, yes, he was my teaching fellow 3 times at Harvard, and I was thrilled when he got his first academic position because, you know, profs worry about that sort of thing. But then he got here, which is just over the moon. So I'm so delighted that he got his dream job. My subject tonight is the struggle to achieve economic democracy and break white supremacy in the social gospel of the progressive era and today. The white social gospel of the progressive era responded to industrialization and corruption, developing a theology of social salvation. The black social gospel of the same period was a struggle for a new abolitionism that built protest organizations and paved the way to the civil rights movement of Martin Luther King Jr., the greatest story we have in this country. Both of these traditions had democratic socialist flanks that were the wellsprings of every form of liberation theology, showing that struggles for economic justice and racial justice can fold together and must. The white social gospel is justly renowned. It put social justice on the agenda of the ecumenical churches and changed how these churches talked about salvation. It created the ecumenical movement and the field of social ethics. It recovered the social justice emphasis of Hebrew Scripture and the centrality of the kingdom of God in the teaching of Jesus. It established and legitimized liberal theology in American Protestantism, especially at this school. It was the greatest wave of social justice activism ever generated by the ecumenical churches, and it was a species of Christian socialism. The black social gospel, though overlooked for decades, has a greater legacy than any American religious tradition. It arose as a response to the abandonment of Reconstruction and an upsurge of racial terrorism. It enlisted the churches in the struggle for justice and helped to build protest organizations against Jim Crow. It provided the social justice theology of the civil rights movement. When black social gospel leaders became outright socialists, they had more to overcome than their white counterparts. Yet the Christian socialism of Mordecai Johnson, Benjamin Mays, and J. Pius Barber directly influenced and persuaded Dr. King. The black social gospel is the forerunner of all theologies that privilege the experiences of oppressed and excluded peoples. The progressive era added something crucial to the biblical message of letting justice flow like a river and pouring yourself out for the poor and vulnerable. In Europe, the movement for social Christianity was called Christian socialism. In the USA, it had to be called something else. It was not a coincidence that the social gospel, social ethics, sociology, all the social sciences, socialism, and the ideas of social structure, social salvation, and social justice all arose at the same time. Also, corporate capitalism, the trade unions, and the first organizations devoted to racial justice. The social gospel developed a novel doctrine of social salvation, which was based on the emerging sociological idea of social structure, which gave rise to the idea of social justice. The key to the social gospel was its claim that Christianity has a mission to transform the structures of society in the direction of social justice. Neither part of that sentence was a possibility before the 1880s. Before the modern era, nobody knew there was such a thing as social structure. In the social gospel, society became a subject of redemption. Social justice became intrinsic to salvation. The church began to say that salvation must be personal and social to be saving. A bad society makes ordinary people do bad things. A good society helps people become less selfish and violent. There was a key difference between European Christian socialism and the American social gospel. And the difference was not socialism. The American social gospel was a species of evangelical revivalism, a cultural earthquake that should be called the Third Great Awakening. I was looking for Chris Evans to nod, and he did, so okay. I'm doing all right. It proclaimed that America had fallen into miserable corruption, and only a spiritual awakening could save America from its sins. The middle-class ministers who founded the white social gospel burned with shame at being criticized by union organizers. The Knights of Labor arose in the 1870s and had almost 1 million members by 1886. It was a radical Christian industrial union movement with no color bar. It was predominantly Protestant until Catholics poured into it in the mid-1880s. But the Knights got pulled into too many strikes and were violently suppressed by state militias. Then they were surpassed by the American Federation of Labor, AFL, a federation of mostly craft unions. Industrial unionism organizes all the workers in an enterprise into one union. Craft unionism splits the workers in a given enterprise into separate crafts defined by specific functions. The AFL had a few industrial unions, and two in particular, the miners and garment workers. They were the basis of its socialist wing. But the AFL was overwhelmingly a bastion of conservative, insular, racist, sexist, craft unionism that barred Black Americans, women, and entire categories of immigrants, especially Asians. The social gospel emerged during the rise and fall of the Knights of Labor and the ascendance of the AFL. Union organizers blasted the churches for doing nothing for poor and working class people. It was obvious to them which side the churches were on. The churches took the side of the ruling class, no matter what they said about taking no side. In Protestant churches, they said it because mainline Protestants were middle class. In Catholic churches, there were plenty of working class unionists, but Catholicism was a struggling immigrant faith trying to assimilate, and the Vatican very greatly feared the rise of socialism in Europe. The founders of the white middle-class American social gospel, Washington Gladden and Walter Rauschenbusch, were ashamed that the churches came off as the enemy of working people. They resolved to do something about it, and they are justly remembered for it. Meanwhile, the founders of the black social gospel were compelled to ask what a new abolitionism would be. One stream of the black social gospel followed Booker T. Washington, struggling to survive and assimilate in the face of an epidemic of racist terrorism and hostility. Another stream was black nationalist in the narrow sense of the category, back to Africa. They were all nationalist in the broad sense. The third stream was protest-oriented, clustered around W.B. Du Bois and opposed to Booker T. Washington. The fourth stream tried to say yes to both Washington and Du Bois. For decades, people wrote books as though the social gospel, as though none of this existed or mattered. William Simmons, Alexander Crummell, Ida Wells Barnett, Reverdy Ransom, Alexander Walters, Richard Wright Jr., Nanny Burroughs, Molly Church Terrell, Adam Clayton Powell Sr. were just erased from memory. Never mind that everybody I just named was very publicly involved in the ecumenical movement. They're not just operating in segregated space. Black social gospel leaders were an embattled minority in their own denominations because the social gospel was divisive and it got people in trouble. The founders and their successors fought hard for the right to advocate progressive theology and social justice politics. Washington versus Du Bois was at the center of the argument until the Du Bois faction prevailed. The founders were succeeded by a generation of leaders that espoused black social gospel theology from the beginning of their careers. Mordecai Johnson, Benjamin Mays, J. Pius Barber, George Kelsey, Howard Thurman, Adam Clayton Powell Jr., James Farmer. All were role models for Dr. King, who did not come from nowhere. King was steeped in a black social gospel tradition that heard the call for justice in the Bible and sang and preached and marched to redeem this country. I have placed the two U.S. American social gospels in the contexts of European Christian socialism and the abolitionist traditions, while also noting that American social Christianity had a distinctly evangelical cast. The original idea of socialism goes back to the 1820s in England and in France, where Charles Fourier and Robert Owen were the pioneers. The idea was to achieve the unrealized demands of the French Revolution, which never reached the working class. Instead of pitting workers against each other, a cooperative mode of production and exchange would allow them to work for each other. Socialism was about organizing society as a cooperative community. All the early traditions of socialism conceived it as producer cooperatives or cooperative guilds. To the early Christian socialists of the 1840s and 50s, socialism was the cooperative movement. British Anglican socialists Frederick Denison Morris and John Ludlow were the pioneers. Morris taught that cooperation is the moral law of an existing divine moral order, and the church is supposed to reflect the beauty and goodness of the divine order. Other kinds of socialism arose in the later 19th century. Radical democracy, a form of populism. Marxism, a theory of proletarian revolution. Anarcho-syndicalism, a militantly anti-statist communalism. Fabianism, a theory of democratic state socialism. Social democracy, a blend of Marxism and state socialism. Guild socialism, a blend of cooperative and syndical ideas. All these schools of thought blame capitalism for all of society's ills, but religious socialists never did. So there were Christian and Jewish versions of every socialist tradition, with a difference. No definition of socialism as economic collectivism or state control of the economy or any particular ownership scheme is common to the many traditions of socialist thought. Historically, Marxism played the leading role in reducing the idea of socialism to collective ownership, and the Fabian tradition played the second leading role in a very different way. Karl Marx taught that the structure of economic ownership determines the character of an entire society, and socialism is the collective ownership of the means of production and exchange, a sufficient condition for fulfilling the essential aspirations of human beings. He developed the most powerful critique of capitalism ever conceived, inspiring numerous traditions of Marxian criticism. His focus on the factors of production and the structural capitalist tendency to generate crises of overproduction and crash made permanent contributions to social thought. But Marx's dogmatic determinism, catastrophe mentality, and doctrine of proletarian dictatorship wreaked immense harm. He developed his theory during an era in which democracy was merely a form of government, and thus of low importance to him. His denigration of ethical reason obscured his own ethical wellspring. And his fixation on collective ownership relegated anti-racism, feminism, and all other reform causes to secondary status at best. Every kind of socialism retains the original idea of organizing society as a cooperative community, yet there is no core that unites the many schools of socialism or democratic socialism. Even to speak of democratic socialism is to self-consciously register something about the history of socialism. 19th century British socialists did not call themselves democratic socialists, even though most of them were, because democracy was not controversial or divisive for them. Democracy was controversial in continental Marxism, where Marxists contended that existing democracy was a bourgeois fraud and real democracy would emerge only from a proletarian revolution, after which there would be no need of a state. For socialists to lionize democracy as the best road to socialism was just ridiculous from a Marxist standpoint. Democracy would come by making the state irrelevant, as Marxists believed, or by smashing the state, as anarchists believed. Democratic socialists refused to subordinate democracy and its reform causes to a catastrophe vision of deliverance or the demands of a left-wing dictatorship. They said socialists had to be resolutely democratic and liberal on their way to achieving socialism, and not merely on tactical grounds. Edward Bernstein made the classic case for this position in 1899 in the German Social Democratic Party, SPD. He rocked the SPD by doing so, which sealed the break between its orthodox Marxist wing and its democratic socialist wing. The terms democratic socialist and revisionist have been linked ever since. But revisionism doesn't just name this. Revisionism is a necessary enterprise in every intellectual tradition. It names the willingness to revise a stagnant orthodoxy. The rise of an explicitly democratic socialist tradition within continental socialism gradually opened a gap between democratic socialism and social democracy. Democratic socialism is a radical vision of democratic self-determination in every sphere of society. Social democracy is, or at least became, what democratic socialists achieve when they attain power, creating more generous and humane forms of capitalism. In my book, Social Democracy in the Making, I analyzed the European history of the gap between these things, which triggered every revisionist movement of the 20th century. The many-sided Christian socialist tradition is the linchpin of my work. I would not be anywhere near the church or the academy without it. One side of my work is about Kant, Hegel, philosophical theology, and the history of modern theology, and the other side is about the intersections of politics, social theory, social justice, imperialism, and economic democracy. A great deal of the academy finds these to be wholly dissimilar enterprises. I hear it all the time. But to me, these orientations are complementary because I came of age by listening to Martin Luther King and reading Walter Rauschenbusch. And this is one of the chief reasons I was so eager to finally get to be you in one way or another. It's one of the few places where these things actually have come together for the past century. I grew up in a poor, semi-rural, nominally Catholic family in mid-Michigan called Bay County. My parents moved there after growing up in similarly poor areas of Michigan's Upper Peninsula, where my father took abuse for his Native American heritage. At the age of 20, he acquired passably white status by moving to mid-Michigan, something none of his sisters or brothers could have done. When he looked in the mirror, he saw an inferior caste. So the most loving thing he could imagine as a parent was to claim for his children all the white privilege he could get. Today, my father is proudly, even aggressively, Native American, and I appreciate the changes in American society that made it possible for him to reclaim his racial identity. It wouldn't have happened without the Civil Rights Movement. But I am a child of the white lower class, having never experienced or claimed any other racial identity. And this nation has never had a breakthrough for racial justice that did not set off a mighty backlash from my group. We are in one now. In my youth, I got to church occasionally, sometimes hitching a ride with neighbors, which was just enough to be caught by the figure of the crucified Jesus. This God figure who responded to evil with self-sacrificing love provided a religious ideal, a sign of transcendence that broke through my everyday horizon of lower class culture and the next game. Then the stunning witness of the Civil Rights Movement similarly broke through, eventually melding in my thought and feeling with the cross of Christ. I came of age in the climactic years of the movement. My teachers described America as the world's greatest nation in every way and the greatest ever. But the Civil Rights Movement taught a very different lesson. King became the formative figure for me long before I understood much of anything else about politics or religion. Then he was assassinated when I was in high school, and he became not merely the leader of a political movement, even a martyred leader. He was a Jesus figure who died for us, the exemplar of the peacemaking and justice-making way of Jesus. In college, I still didn't belong to a church. I still didn't belong to a church for many years afterwards. So there was nothing holding me in college to theology except Jesus crucified and Martin Luther King. I might not have made it to theology, except for one book, Christianity and the Social Crisis by Rauschenbusch. He described the teaching of Jesus as a message of radical social transformation. He argued that Christianity obscured the revolutionary spirit of the gospel, but it was not too late for the church to adopt the way and spirit of Jesus. The church is supposed to be a new kind of community that transforms the world by the power of Christ's kingdom-bringing spirit. The idea of the indwelling and growing commonwealth of God is not merely part of Christianity, it's the central thing holding everything else together. Christianity is a kingdom movement that carries God into everything you do. In a chapter titled What to Do, Rauschenbusch made a scintillating case for democratic socialism. His gospel-centered liberal theology and radical politics were equally compelling to me. I turned the pages just exclaiming, this is what Christianity should sound like. Why doesn't it? For years, I'd felt that King laid hold of something in Christianity that the rest of the church just somehow missed. Something inspiring movement idealism and a real surge for social change. Rauschenbusch explained what was missing, and he expressed brilliantly the vision of a socially regenerative faith. The one thing I couldn't fathom was that Rauschenbusch said nothing at all in this book about racism and lynching. That was my first research question. If Rauschenbusch could be so powerful about economic oppression, how could he say nothing about the racist violence right in front of him? In my 20s, I was a solidarity organizer and held leadership positions in 3 national solidarity organizations. At the age of 30, I became an Episcopal priest. And at 35, belatedly, I became an academic, in a story I told in this room yesterday. And by then, I had written 3 books, but still had no answer to my Rauschenbusch question. I didn't know Chris Evans in those years, so, I just went on not knowing. But in 1995, I wrote a book called Soul and Society, and I came across an obscure article that Rauschenbusch wrote in 1914. Actually, it was in Methodist Review, wasn't it, Chris? There he explained that his early work said nothing about racism because this subject was distinctly depressing and hopeless. His aim was always to inspire readers to build the kingdom of God, but everything he knew about American racism refuted his claim, utterly refuted his claim that it was happening. If Rauschenbusch was to be an agent of hope in racist America, he could not fold a chapter about racism into one of his books. Even his later books, after he admitted all this, only mentioned it in a sentence or 2. Black social gospel leaders knew all about the trauma of sustaining hope in a terrible situation. They dealt with it every day. But to them, the response of mute hopelessness was an ethical impossibility. If Christianity had any moral meaning in the U.S. American context, it had to begin with the evils of racism and hatred that oppressed Black Americans. I studied British Christian socialists long before I had any inkling whatsoever that they were leading me into the Episcopal Church. All of them were schooled in the lore of the British Empire, which turned many of them into vehement anti-imperialists and anti-racists. To them, empire was a problem of power lust and military overreach corrected by good politics. They said that Tories were the bad party because they were shameless imperialists. But in the 1880s, John Hobson said a new kind of imperialism was emerging that had to be opposed differently than the old kind. Hobson was a radical Democrat who deeply influenced the Anglican socialists of his time and who later became a democratic socialist himself. He said the new imperialism was driven by economic competition for new markets. He wrote 10 books about this turn as it occurred, and then he wrote his famous book, Imperialism, in 1902, contending that modern capitalism was just unsustainable without exploiting colonized markets. Hobson was slow to acquire American readers, but after Europe plunged into World War I, Du Bois leaned on Hobson and the British socialists to explain what was happening. In 1875, the European powers controlled 1/10 of the African continent. By 1900, they had devoured nearly the entire continent. Hobson said the plunder of Africa relied on the equation of color with inferiority. Du Bois said, this is not one factor on a list. It is the crucial thing. The European powers took an important lesson from the British and American slave trades. The pillage and rape of Africa could be called something else if black people were less than human. France built a northern African empire. Germany seized colonies in Africa. Portugal expanded its claims to African territory. Western movements for democracy and progress played crucial roles in accelerating the flow of finance capital to far-off lands, ratcheting up the clash of empires. Democracy was supposed to be the answer to the terrible problems of inequality, exploitation, and oppression. The ship of state was supposedly launched on the great tide of democratic expansion. Yet as democracy spread, so did the rule of might, regardless of which party won office. Democracy and imperialism grew together, unless what? In England, the Labour Party became the vehicle of the Christian socialist answer. In the USA, Du Bois joined the Socialist Party, but its leader, Eugene Debs, said as little as possible about racism. Eugene Debs had his simplistic, magical, semi-Marxist concept of socialism as the cure for all social problems. Since only socialism would abolish racism, he fixed solely on the struggle for socialism. The sophistry of that approach just galled Du Bois. Du Bois was a progressive who believed in radical democracy, and he voted for democratic socialists for the rest of his life. But he cautioned that the seemingly paradoxical wedding of democracy and imperialism was not really puzzling. White workers were asked to share the spoils of exploiting people of color. The chief exploiter role that formerly belonged to the merchant prince passed to the aristocratic monopoly, then to the capitalist class, and now to the democratic nation. Du Bois said the only solution to this miserable picture was for democratic socialism to reach all the way to the poor and excluded, not stopping with white workers. The movements for socialism, union organizing, and democracy had made a beginning. The capitalist class would yield to the unions as long as it found new markets to exploit. The national bond was no longer based on something flimsy like patriotism or loyalty or ancestor worship. It was based on the wealth that creates a middle class and flows to the working class. But most of this new wealth rested on the exploitation of Asians, Africans, South Americans, and West Indians. Du Bois believed that capitalist exploitation per se was not the reason why Germans and Britons were slaughtering each other in France. Socialism was advancing in Germany and Britain, yet both governments took for granted their right to rule and exploit non-white peoples. World War I was about which group of white nations would do so. Du Bois acknowledged that Japan did not play along, because Japan demanded white treatment without allying with white nations. China, too, was increasingly independent, but everything depended on how far democracy expanded. Du Bois put it plainly. If progressive movements accelerated the imperial logic of modern capitalism, the only solution was to universalize democracy. If the movements for liberalism, unionism, anti-imperialism, and socialism were to create a decent world, they had to struggle for democracy everywhere. He implored that democracy, radical democracy, is distinctly transformative. First, the movements for democratic socialism had to win power wherever they existed. Then they had to fulfill the universalism of their creed. Otherwise, socialism was the worst form of hypocrisy. Du Bois believed that for the rest of his life. The universality of the socialist idea was not a problem for him. The problem was the lack of it. Rauschenbusch wrote his last book, A Theology for the Social Gospel, near the end of World War I. It had 7 chapters on sin, culminating in a devastating chapter called The Kingdom of Evil. He said the old orthodoxy obsessed over personal foibles while ignoring massive social evils. Human beings are bonded to each other in their bondage to sin, but some nations are drenched in the blood of victims. Rauschenbusch described America's mania of lynching as the ultimate example of evil transmitted through socialization. Evil is insidious in modern life, but only social gospel theology made sense of this fact. He implored that if the kingdom of God is democratizing, the church was overdue to democratize God. God strives within our feeling, kindles a flame in our intellect, makes our will restless for righteousness, floods our self-conscious mind with dreams and longings, and lures us to freedom and solidarity. He argued that only Christianity and democratic socialism combined could break the power of nationalism and the ruling class. The idea of replacing capitalist selfishness and inequality with economic democracy was intrinsic to the social gospel. It doesn't just define the left flank. Nearly the entire social gospel movement was socialist in the broad sense of advocating producer cooperatives and the nationalization of natural monopolies. But there was an important divide in the social gospel between those who emphasized the class struggle and those who relied on moral idealism. This division existed in both social gospel traditions across the color line. Reverdy Ransom and Vita Scudder were on the socialist side, and Richard Wright Jr. and Shaler Matthews were prominent on the liberal progressive reformer side. This divide between socialists and progressives played out fatefully after Rauschenbusch was gone, as Reinhold Niebuhr stereotyped the entire social gospel as sentimental, moralistic, idealistic, pacifist, and naive. Especially naive. Niebuhr first made this argument in the early 1930s when he was a radical socialist. He was attacking it from the left. He made a devastating case, demonstrating, among other things, the power of ridicule. But Niebuhr's description was a polemical caricature, and he kept saying it long after he changed his politics. In the 1930s, he said there was no alternative to the choice between revolutionary state socialism and fascist barbarism. Economic democracy was serious only if it meant outright government control of the economy. Many joined Niebuhr in repudiating the social gospel and the New Deal. Wrongly, Niebuhr and his followers equated socialization with nationalization and rejected production for profit. Wrongly, they claimed that state planners could replicate the pricing decisions of markets and that government planners should organize an economy not linked by markets. In the usual rendering of modern theology, the social gospel was naive, as Niebuhr said, and Niebuhr is the hero of the story. I accept this rendering for the period of the early 1940s, but not for the 1930s or the 1950s, and certainly not the 1960s. In 1932, the Federal Council of Churches issued a new edition of its social creed, now calling for public control of the credit and monetary systems, the right to collective bargaining, and equal rights for all people, period. The social gospel leaders of the council went on to campaign for worker ownership, select government ownership, social security, and public infrastructure projects. They helped FDR build the New Deal, while Niebuhr said it was stupid and naive. On these issues, the Christian socialists, like Walter Mueller, who cited Rauschenbusch, were better than the Niebuhrian realists. Rauschenbusch advocated mixed forms of worker, community, and public ownership, and he argued that markets cannot be abolished in a free society. The radical ideologies of the 1930s just crashed and burned. But the economic democracy of the social gospel is as relevant today as ever. Moreover, unlike Niebuhr and Paul Tillich, Rauschenbusch did not say that economic democracy is pointless without a proletarian revolution. Thus, he never quit pressing for it, unlike Niebuhr and Tillich, who both capitulated in the 1950s. Rauschenbusch said that ethical idealism by itself never changed anything, yet without it, nothing changes. This was a bedrock truism to the Christian socialists, black and white, who hung in there. Niebuhr warned King through the 1950s to slow down. He was pushing too hard. King, Mordecai Johnson, Benjamin Mays, J. Pius Barber, Miles Horton, Pauli Murray, Walter Mueller, S. Paul Schilling, the left wing of the social gospel, refused to slow down. I have made an argument for holding together the struggles against racism and economic domination, focusing on black and white traditions of social gospel socialism. But holding together the multiple forms of domination has never come easily, and certainly does not in our time. The classic works of liberation theology are vague and thin on political economics, and a great deal of cultural left theory just dispenses altogether with economic justice. Economic justice and cultural recognition must work together. Every form of injustice is rooted simultaneously in the political economy and the status order. No struggle for justice can succeed lacking a politics of redistribution, a politics of recognition, and today, a new global politics of politics itself, sharing a world no longer run by sovereign Westphalian states. The leading theories of redistributive justice have earned their place in the canon. Marxism is a redistributive theory focusing on capitalist exploitation. John Rawls elaborated a theory focused on the fair distribution of primary goods. Amartya Sen and Ronald Dworkin developed theories focused respectively on equal capabilities to function and approximate equality of resources. All these theories provide some way of accounting for racial, gendered, and sexual harm, but in derivative fashion. Redistribution theories silence or marginalize the most pressing causes of harm for denigrated groups. Cultural accounts of injustice are symbolic, rooting injustice in social patterns of interpretation and representation. Here, the defining injustices are disrespect, being rendered invisible, and being judged by norms that are alien to your culture. But recognition strategies try to mitigate unjust outcomes without changing the underlying economic structures. Both of these orientations have reason to safeguard the priority of their claims, and there is a structural conflict between them. Recognition promotes group differentiation, while the logic of redistribution abolishes it. Nancy Fraser has devoted most of her career as a feminist social theorist to this very problem. She devised a social spectrum bordered at one end by the redistribution model and the other end by the recognition model, construing gender and race as hybrid modes in the middle, combining features of an exploited class and an oppressed sexuality. Both forms of injustice are primary and co-original. Fraser ended up with a four-celled matrix, placing redistribution and recognition at opposite ends of a vertical axis and affirmation and transformation remedies at opposite ends of a horizontal axis. Affirmation remedies operate within the system. Transformation remedies abolish it. Two combinations came out better than all the other possibilities. The welfare state meshes consistently with mainstream multiculturalism, since both of them are affirmation strategies. Democratic socialism and cultural deconstruction also go together, since both are transformation strategies. Fraser argued that combining democratic socialism and cultural deconstruction is the only way to do justice to all struggles against injustice. Affirmative strategies assume a zero-sum game and do not promote coalition building. The conflict between redistribution and recognition is especially acute across collectivities, such as gay and working class, or black and female. Affirmation strategies work additively and conflict with each other. Transformation strategies try to promote synergy, not being zero-sum. I have thought with and against Nancy Fraser for many years. I admire her expansive vision and her emphasis on socialist transformation. I do not accept her harsh critique of the welfare state and multiculturalism, and I am opposed to undermining the gains of progressive politics in these areas. The right is out to destroy the welfare state, affirmative action, and multicultural education. I am not for helping it in any way. For the very same reason, I am not the kind of democratic socialist who accentuates the cleavage between democratic socialism and social democracy. At least social democracy achieves universal health care and solidarity wage policies. But I do believe that social democratic parties and movements lose their soul when they don't fight for new and old forms of economic democracy. For over a decade, we hotly debated redistribution versus recognition on the left, and harsh things were said. It felt like it would never end. Richard Rorty and Tot Gidlin charged that identity politics ruined the left by spurning the struggle for economic justice, competing for victim status, and fixing on taking over the English department. Judith Butler replied that the cultural left is the only one we have anymore, so the old lefties should stop whining about it and show some gratitude. My forthcoming book on American democratic socialism rehashes this grim, painful, sometimes despairing debate. But then neoliberalism played out, and we were compelled to grapple with the political dimension of justice. The economy-culture binary leaves no room for the political sphere of law, citizenship, and institutions that precede economic and cultural injustice. Political injustice is a category unto itself and a problem of multiplying global complexity. The problems of representation are fundamental justice concerns. Who is included? What are the rules? Distribution and recognition are political and contesting for policy objectives, but politics determines how the state organizes itself and structures struggles for justice. The image of justice as a scale held by a blindfolded judge evokes one enduring test of justice: impartiality. In the modern period, the image of justice as a Westphalian map evokes the problems of the bounds of justice, which is the framing issue. What is the scale of justice on which contested heterogeneous claims might be impartially weighed? How should the bounds of justice be framed in a world pitting environmentalists, human rights activists, NGOs, the global poor, transnational corporations, national governments, and international institutions against each other in various shifting patterns, generating multiple kinds of representation claims? The image of the scale has been stretched to the breaking point because parties no longer fight over something that can be weighed on a single scale. Movements demanding economic redistribution clash with defenders of the economic status quo, and with movements defending specific groups, and with representational claims on behalf of the global poor, refugees, the global environment, and world peace. When groups clash over these claims, the threat of partiality is exceeded by the specter of incommensurability. The framing question supersedes the questions of how much inequality is tolerable and what constitutes equal respect. Who are the subjects entitled to just distribution and reciprocal recognition? Politics is about representation, furnishing the stage on which movements for redistribution and recognition take place. We need the noble work of politics more than ever now that it's failing us, yielding right-wing nationalist governments across the world, not just here. The defining political injustice is to be misrepresented, to be wrongly prevented by a rule or a boundary from participating equally with others. The deepest form of it is when the boundaries of a community are drawn to wrongly exclude some people from even participating in contests over justice. Fraser calls it misframing, the denial of a right to have any rights. Globalization generates and exposes misframing. It grows the sector of institutions holding little relationship to a national government, and it exposes that the modern state is a powerful instrument of injustice, gerrymandering political space at the expense of the poor and vulnerable. If you have no standing, you cannot struggle for redistribution or recognition. Nobody knows what the post-Westphalian frame should be or is going to be. Read Wendy Brown, one of our foremost authorities on this topic, and it's just mostly questions. I believe, with Fraser, that it must begin with the socialist principle that all who are affected by a given structure or institution should hold moral standing as subjects of justice in relation to it. National governments are too selfish not to fail this test, and we are living in a time of escalating nationalism. Today, there are two fronts of the struggle to achieve the principle of all affected moral standing. One is the prosaic, everyday, boring, normal, political struggle to achieve mere decency and generosity in government policies. The other is the global fight led especially by environmentalists, indigenous peoples, and feminists to claim their standing as subjects of justice. There is a right to make a claim of injustice against any power that causes harm. At least, there should be. I wrote Social Democracy in the Making during the period that Bernie Sanders first ran for president. And Donald Trump won the White House by lifting white resentment, racism, xenophobia, and nationalism to highest importance. I spent a lot of time that year talking to reporters about the crowds that Sanders attracted and how he conceives democratic socialism. Day after day, Bernie conveyed his gut-level rage that the system is rigged to siphon most of the wealth to exceedingly rich people. I loved him for it, even as I lamented his limitations. Bernie sings in one key only, and he never broke through to African American voters, which caused many of us who worked pretty hard for him to regret that he never had to try until he ran for president. He radiates an old left way of thinking that never quite fathomed why cultural recognition matters so much. Sanders says that every American should have a right to a job paying a living wage, quality health care, a complete education, affordable housing, a clean environment, and a secure retirement. These 6 economic rights define what he calls democratic socialism. Journalists have proved to be remarkably incurious about this subject. Not a single reporter in 4 years, despite ample prompting on my part, has asked Sanders if he supports worker ownership or decentralized forms of public ownership or mixed models of cooperative and decentralized public ownership. In 2015, he said he opposes government ownership and his model of democratic socialist society is Denmark. Journalists just keep repeating this answer without poking any further into it. Neoliberalism treats labor and nature as commodities and assumes a fantasy of unlimited growth. Somehow, the earth is physical and limited, but growth can be unlimited. Economic democracy and ecological survival are linked by the necessity of creating alternatives to this system. The Earth's ecosystem is not something external to us. It's everything bundled together with feedback loops and interconnected wholes. Economic democracy begins by expanding the cooperative sector. Producer cooperatives take labor out of the market by removing corporate shares from the stock market and maintaining local worker ownership. Community land trusts take land out of the market and place it under local democratic controls to serve the needs of communities. Community finance corporations take democratic control over capital to finance cooperative firms and make investments in areas of social need. These strategies reclaim the principle that democratic ownership is a factor in building a just society. Social control of enterprises can mean public management representing the community of the local, regional, or national level, or cooperative management based on individual ownership in which each member owns one share of the enterprise, or cooperative management in which workers own a firm collectively as a group, or a blend of public and cooperative models. Social rights to income can mean that the surplus of the enterprise accrues to the public through a local, regional, or national government agency, or to a cooperative enterprise, or to a blend of both. As a rule, I favor cooperative ownership because it achieves direct, democratic, humane, human scale, interpersonal self-determination at the firm or guild level. But cooperatives have trouble scaling up. Public ownership works better in industries and enterprises with large economies of scale or extensive externalities. And public enterprises pay greater heed than cooperatives to the common good. Cooperatives are usually underfinanced because banks don't like them. And cooperatives prohibit non-working shareholders. They're committed to keeping low-return firms in operation, so they stay in business even when they can't pay competitive wages. They're committed to particular communities, so they fall behind their corporate competitors. They maximize net income per worker rather than profits, so they favor capital-intensive investments over job creation. These problems reflect the virtues of cooperatives, and all of them can be mitigated with tax incentives and regulations that promote job expansion, reinvestment, innovation, and bank support. But even cooperatives aided by better financing and incentives are biased toward capital-intensive investments. Capitalist firms readily scale up because they have structural incentives to grow under conditions of constant returns to scale. When costs per item are a constant, capitalist firms are predisposed to grow to increase profits. Doubling the size of a capitalist firm doubles its profit. Cooperatives maximize share income per worker, not total profits, so they don't automatically expand production when demand increases. Unless sizable economies of scale kick in, cooperatives have little to gain by doubling their size. A cooperative hardware store run by 30 people will have the same per worker share income as one run by 60 people or 90 people. Cooperatives, therefore, don't do enough to combat inequality. Traditional cooperatives have a crucial role to play. But economic democracy cannot be merely about expanding the cooperative sector. It must create democratic institutions that treat all citizens as stakeholders in the economic system. We need new forms of social ownership that facilitate democratic capital formation, are innovative and entrepreneurial, that scale up and benefit the entire society, and don't create bloated government bureaucracies. The mutual fund model is designed to address these very concerns. It generates social funds through an excess profits tax or a tax on Wall Street transactions. It places a semi-autonomous investment agency or a holding company between the state and the enterprise management, which becomes a firewall enhancing market discipline. The holding company vests the ownership of productive capital. It lends capital to enterprises at the market rate of interest, and it pays attention to market signals. The famous Mondragon cooperatives in Spain offer an example of it. But the biggest scale version thus far that we have seen was the Meidner Plan for Economic Democracy in Sweden, which got a 10-year run. In 1982, the Social Democratic government enacted an annual 20% tax on major company profits payable in the form of stock to 8 regional mutual funds. Worker, consumer, and government representatives controlled the funds, and as the proportion of stock ownership held by these constituencies grew, they were collectively entitled to representation on company boards. Locals and branch funds jointly held voting rights of the employee shares. A 40% ceiling was placed on the amount of stock that the 8 funds could own of any single firm. The funds were managed conventionally, and the Social Democrats back then said as little as possible about the Meidner Plan because they were just trying not to inflame the business community and the political right. The Meidner Plan worked perfectly well, except politically. It contained a built-in system of wage restraints. It created new investment capital. It operated on a decentralized basis, and it sought the highest rate of return. It assigned production risks to enterprise management and entrepreneurial risks to the holding companies. Big business groups and the political right railed against it incessantly. Stock markets are the home turf of financiers, a privilege that Sweden's financial class defended very aggressively. It didn't matter to them that the funds were managed conservatively and the Social Democrats played nice. The very idea of economic democracy offended the financial class. Meanwhile, the Social Democrats defended it so timidly that it felt abstract to the general population. Ordinary people needed to see how the plan benefited everybody. Instead, its enemies killed it in 1992. Today, the Meidner Plan is a symbol of social democracy going too far, crossing a line that the capitalist class does not tolerate. It is a benchmark of what economic democracy would look like. A bigger scale example than German co-determination or the Mondragon cooperatives. A good society makes public provisions that recognize the equal dignity and rights of everyone. Equality is the antidote to privilege, which is a function of interrelated social and economic power. Democratizing power is the antidote to tyranny, which is a function of the distribution of power. The goal is for human freedom and fellowship to flourish in a shared ecosystem. R.H. Tawney was the most eloquent defender of these principles of the 20th century. He was a British Anglican socialist, but he chafed at the Christian socialist label because he was pluralistic about religion and not about socialism. For Tawney, as for Du Bois, socialism was universal. Everybody should be a socialist. America is the place where Christian socialism had to be called the social gospel. And people like me had to allude very gently for many years to the S word. Now that has changed dramatically. A great rebellion is underway against severe inequality and destroying the planet. It frontally challenges the convention that democratic socialism is impossibly un-American. There is more interfaith community organizing occurring today than ever. Pico Faith in Action is surging, and Gamaliel's making a comeback. Medicare for everyone has become a mainstream position in the Democratic Party. The public option is the fallback option. Strike Debt and Debt Jubilee Coalition are leading a debt resistance movement. 350.org is scaling up, acquiring political muscle all over the globe, pressuring institutions to divest from fossil fuels. The New Economy Coalition has worked since 2014 to connect all the groups that believe in economic democracy and the green economy. Even the United States Congress finally has a bill that talks about the climate crisis on the scale that it exists. Maybe it's too late. But as someone who vividly remembers the 1980s and 90s, I much prefer this moment that we are in. The love ethic of Jesus makes you care, makes you angry, throws you into the struggle, keeps you in it, helps you face another day. To hang in there against the principalities and powers, one has to have a certain stubborn ethical outrage. And it helps to have a spiritual wellspring. Thank you, friends.
We have some time for conversation. There is a microphone over here to my left. So in case you have a question, we still have a few minutes to conversate.
My icebreaker, 2 days in a row.
Just so you know, Gary is teaching me and my class about social ethics. So one of the things he says that I love about him is he says he always welcomes my questions, because I tend to be the one in class that people don't like my questions because they're not on topic. So whatever that means. So it's been really wonderful having him as our professor in residence. I believe that's his title here, and learning from him. But I guess what I get stuck in is I get really angry about things that happen because it's not right and it's not fair. And then I don't know what to do with that anger besides keep getting angry, like how to act on the anger for justice and for righteousness. So how do I do that well?
I think the crucial thing there is to be involved with people, being actually just literally involved in communities that are doing this work, and befriending people who've been doing it for a long time. I mean, once you get involved in this kind of work, you get involved in an IAF or Gamaliel or DART or PICO, which is now Faith in Action, or any of those kind of groups, Interfaith Worker Justice, any such group, or some kind of group that's sort of morphed off what those kinds of groups do, or any of the peace and justice fellowships in the churches, but now I'm ruining my example, so forget that one. Work in which you get secular and religious people involved, working together in the work of justice. One thing you will notice over time is that it's the religious people who are the ones who hang in there, for whom they have this sort of ethic. It's just sort of a given to them that what they're called to be is faithful to something, right? And so success is not sort of the criterion of efficacy or the worthwhileness of what they're doing. And so it is those people who've got a spiritual wellspring who are the ones who are hanging in there longer. This is why my religious group example wasn't going to work, because of course that's all they are there. But even there, what ends up mattering is though that handful of people who are, it's the Norm Faramelli types, who've just been there, been one of the saints in an area just forever, and are welcome one generation after another into this work. Seeing how they do it, just seeing the fact that they have, and that they have gained strength for the journey all these years by virtue of the relationships that go on here. Because this isn't just guilt work where you're just pouring yourself out with nothing coming back to you. Movement work is enabling. It brings out the best in people, and gives them capacities for doing the work that they didn't have previously, certainly, and could never have on their own. I do think that sort of that work is the key. There's just nothing else like it. I do think that's the answer.
You mentioned the Meigner plan as your ideal model of, or not ideal, but a good model.
Yeah.
I wonder how you address, specifically the claim that a lot of, especially the Nordic model, socialist movements are based fundamentally on imperialism because they require that system of imperialism that's in place, especially with the relationship between the European Union and obviously the Third World. How you address that, especially because anything, as I've read at least, anything that operates within the nation state is going to have to function within that system of national interaction that has been so imperialist and remains so imperialist?
Thank you. It's a wonderful question, and it's not only cutting edge; it's so far in front of where what we need to move into. Firstly, it is telling, it matters that the Achilles heel of democratic socialism as a form of politics, as a form of trying to get anywhere politically in any national context, has always been this issue, that it is, in fact, way deep down, it is not a nationalist ideology, it's internationalist. It's global. It is not tied to any or national anything. But then that becomes the problem for it was the problem for we got Marxists in Germany in 1900 who are facing the problem quite brutally because they're getting somewhere. The idea that they're on the cusp of getting some of it's not a utopia, that they're going to be in power pretty soon. And the one thing holding them back is that you can't trust them, right? You can always hit the democratic socialist thing. You can't trust them because they're not good. They're not good Germans. They're not good French. Whatever. They're not good Brits. Read Paul Tillich, one of the great works, probably the greatest work of religious socialism ever written. Paul Tillich's Socialist Decision. It just takes over that book about 2/3 of the way through. Tillich grappling with this problem and grappling with it brilliantly, and yet coming out in a way that's really terrible. That he trashes the SPD, trashes its record in a way that isn't even true, in order to say this could still come out, because Tillich is trying to be more political than the SPD was over the course of the SPD's own compromising history. I mean, the SPD was so compromised that on August 4th, 1914, they all rolled over for World War I and just destroyed what was the Second International. And even Tillich, a generation later, knowing that this is the problem for socialists, that if you're trying to get somewhere, you're running for office, go ahead and tell yourself that anything we do on that end is just sort of serving the revolution. That's what the Orthodox Marxist Party did. That's the Kautsky, answer. That's what we're doing. We can reconcile these two things because we're the body, we're the party of the revolution. But if it's a party of a Marxist revolution, how is it that you can make a claim that you can be trusted with the national franchise when the nation is very eager to get into the colonizing business, because it's the obsession of most Germans, to be frank, to pull together. They felt, and that just given with their history. They weren't even a nation until 1815, didn't get the empire until 1871, that's just through Prussia. And now they're latecomers to the spoils of Africa as well. And so, they have that. And it's all of it is working against what you could get, really should get from Marxism, and yet they're planted places. Karl Marx, was holed up in the British Museum in England, a person without a country. He couldn't get back to Germany. There they are trying to make a go of it in a real place. And this issue of how this is always the hardest one of them all. So of course it's hard to live into. It's hard to at any stage getting somewhere politically. It's always the thing that can be called against them. But of course that's not even just true of, we're out here on the lefty side here talking about democratic socialism. That's the most effective form of ridicule of any kind of progressive politics, of any kind. I don't care what it is. Some of you know I wrote 2 books on neoconservatism and spent a good part of my life debating neocons and speaking against the war and so on. And that's what fueled that movement. That's how all those people got jobs in the first Bush administration, and the rest before that the Reagan administration, and then the later Bush administration. They have a genius for turning every question into a question about how pro-American you are, or how, in your case, how anti-American you are. Right? Let's register how anti-American you are. They can just turn. There's just not an issue on our. There's not a thing I referred to tonight that can't just be plotted on that grid and then politicized against you. So let's not kid ourselves that there's some way out of that, unless we're just going to go fully anarchist and just say it's just a matter of, we just got to destroy things and then hope something better comes. But I got to tell you, I was pretty deeply involved in such a thing a few years ago, and I had some issues with how that went. Occupy Wall Street was, it was run by anarchists who weren't accountable, right? Oh, we don't have leaders. Actually, we did have leaders, but who weren't accountable for what leadership they made. So they were kind of fixed in. It was a kind of an anarchist kind of thing that was running what happened at Zuccotti Park, and that did not feel very good to me. Although it was, I do think that was the moment. I mean, I think we've been in a different moment since Occupy. That we've got a generation now that's just, we've seen what comes of neoliberalism, and it's hard to say why it didn't happen in 2008, 9, 10. Well, why did it take until 2011? But there came a moment when we saw that people are fed up. They've now just had it. With 40 years of just letting the banks just do whatever they want and having government policies that just accommodate them. As you can see now, I am not for trying to make a hard policy based on the hardest of all questions, which is this one. And it is the hardest for any kind of social democratic socialist, even progressive of any kind, anything to get anywhere politically. You are going to be the thing that you are exposed to and are most vulnerable on is just, can we trust you? I don't think we can. So it's not like we can get away from that. Yes.
What kind of democratic structures can be built into economic democracy will guarantee the equities of God's non-human creation when it can't participate in the democracy itself?
I think it's just a conversation about that very thing. I've seen it happen because I'm old enough to have known some old lefties, right, who just didn't have it at all. For whom they learned their Marxism and they couldn't be shamed and couldn't be taught about anything else. So I entered a movement where that was one flank, was just old left, kind of old red kind of Marxists, for whom, they just know how this goes. But then came washing into their earliest solidarity groups I was in, including both of Michael Harrington's organizations, movements from the new left and different kinds of feminism and the green movements and the multiple forms of consciousness that are making something more expansive, more unwieldy, to be sure. But I think in my experience, that is how consciousness changes, not just individually, but within groups as conversations expand, and you get people in your organizing, in your movements, for whom we're different. So there are going to be different things that even if we can all agree about 10 or 15 things, one or two are just going to grab us in some really deep way. That is what is mobilizing and galvanizing and sort of keeps you in there. And I think one of the worst things about the earlier forms of lefty kind of organizing that I was involved in was this sort of tendency to think, no, there's only one such hierarchy of oppression and way of responding to a call. And then you're not respecting what it is for other people. This is a very hard thing. And this is actually something, I have a speech on this, as you maybe can tell, in a secular left politics, where I tell them, this is something you could learn from religious people. Religious people, in fact, deal with this all the time. People who are pastors, people who are holding together denominations, people who are holding together ecumenical social justice, anything, are always having to deal with various kinds of people in the room, people who just way deep down, when their conscience rings, it's about different things. and finding ways of just respecting that and then building something better together. That's always been the work of religiously informed social justice people. We're far ahead of what the secular left has traditionally been. There, it's the tendency is to sort of divide up and just keep your silo and privilege whatever you think is right. So we're just now even discovering what it would mean to even to live into wider forms of kind of a green consciousness, where just the natural world itself. I mean, I'm self-conscious about this standing right here, because here we are, Boston University. What do they always say against personalism? Oh, it's an anthropocentric God, right? Just turning God into a projection of ourselves. You can't get to the natural world through personalism. Well, in fact, you can, right? Personalism can take you to get your arms around the entire world. But this then did become something that you have to overcome within personalism. The fact that so many people say this, the fact that so many people said it for so long, this is why you need to go to Whitehead, because those personalists just didn't have enough of a sort of a sense of it, just about any kind of nature that isn't human nature. That's why you couldn't be a personalist. This is the very thing that did, personalism went down, faded over this very issue. And I think it's terribly important to say it's didn't have to be that way. But there is a lack of advocacy, and there's no question that the personalists were outdone. I mean, the Whiteheadian group was better at this. I mean, it just speaks to this question in a way that's so clearly. I mean, it's just more direct. It's just there. You don't need to dig hard to get it out of Whitehead, or certainly out of Catherine Keller, and that's why there's so many. Dean Moore types, in liberal theology, for whom, that was the gravitational pull.
And thank you so much for just giving us a lot to think about. I guess I have to ask, I can't let you go tonight without asking you about 2020. Oh. And one of the things that you've really pointed out tonight, I think, which is very important, is the way that the left, and particularly different forms of what could be called democratic socialism, and just the larger trajectory of Christian socialism that you've plotted, has had a tremendous impact culturally and on different models of economic justice, and really creating a larger consciousness that has continued to grow into our time. I would say, however, and I think part of your lecture also points this out, the left has been notoriously bad at winning elections and forming political coalitions. I mean, I think you can point to a few times historically where that has happened, but there's a lot right now that frankly is very depressing for me when I look towards 2020. So that is kind of the first thing I wanted to raise. But the second thing is, and I guess maybe this is where I'm asking you to sort of state what worries you and what gives you hope when you look at the future trajectory of American politics. Over the summer, I was in Pennsylvania, and driving through about a 100-mile swath of eastern Pennsylvania, I saw all kinds of billboards that said either God bless Donald Trump or Jesus is coming. Now, maybe I think the two are probably interconnected in some way, but it just really brought out to me, and I'm sorry, folks, the Electoral College, you can say all you want about it, but we're not going to get rid of it in the next 2 years. And we've got to win states like Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, the type of areas and the type of constituencies that you know from your childhood growing up. I guess I'm asking, to what extent is it possible to really create in the mainstream of American culture the kind of democratic, and particularly the Christian democratic socialism that you're envisioning? And also from the standpoint, win or lose, Trump is not going away. I mean, we're going to have to face for several generations the kind of heinous disease that he represents. What things can you say to us to give us both a sense of hope that this vision that you espouse is going to be in some way mainstream in American culture, and if it's not, what's going to keep us going?
Oh, wow. Well, thank you, Chris. So we're going to end with this, right? This is it? Oh, man. Before I even get rolling on this, I think, do you want to register a note about what you said near the end there? The first campaign I was involved in, I worked very hard for George McGovern in 1972, which was a very instructive enterprise. To have worked as hard as I did, to be repelled at grocery stores and going door to door by fellow Americans who just thought I was the devil for, supporting this person who to me was just, he was just a down the middle, a good-hearted liberal, right? But that even says something, that I have never needed someone to say certain words for me to, I would not have wanted George McGovern to use half the words, I used here tonight. I knew who he was, and I've sort of long worked for candidates of that sort. For me, the issue, as far as that goes, when it comes to campaigns per se, has always been, all right, do I get in with both feet? In which case, now I'm part of that campaign, and I can't do certain kinds of church work. Or do I not? Got to stay out enough that I can do certain kinds of church work and be in a different church every week, and not be a representative of a campaign. And that's the issue for me every go round in a campaign. And there have been a couple times in my life that I'm going to try to give the concise version of this part that I gave longer yesterday. There have been a couple times in my life when I just swept aside everything I was doing and had to just go full bore for something quite in particular. Once was when I knew, it was a year off, but I knew we were going to invade Iraq. And so, I'm halfway through volume 3 of Liberalism and just pushed it all into a corner and just went full bore against what I knew was coming, because I already know all these neocons and I know full well what they're up to and going to be able to do, which of course they did. So that just took over my life for a couple of years. And then in 2012, I did a similar thing. Where I just pushed aside everything I was doing and wrote the Obama question and then hit the road very, very hard over it, because I did feel like that the election of 2012 was just a fire alarm emergency in this country. And even though I had all manner of conflict about how all the things that didn't go the way they should have in that first Obama administration, I was still going to work as hard as I could for him to make sure that a disaster didn't occur, halfway through his watch. So I've had these two occasions where I just swept it all aside and just went all in on one thing. And I'll tell you, a couple of years ago, I thought maybe that's going to happen now again. That maybe this Trump business is just I'm going to just sweep it all aside, and Hegel's going to have to wait, and all of it, if I just find a way of doing that. But what I ended up just feeling over time is that the whole crisis is so total and so totalizing. It is so deeply, fundamentally interconnected all the way down and all around that I couldn't just name it as one thing and then just only do that. So, yes, 2 big volumes on the Black Social Gospel, 2 big volumes on democratic socialism, and Hegel still got his book, that's coming in a few months, and just trying always to try to speak in a way that gets my arms around it. And now we've got a campaign coming, and I'm very much for somebody. I think Elizabeth Warren is a fabulous candidate, and I don't see anything lacking there. I've still got an issue about, does that mean I should go in both feet or do what I do in churches? Right now I'm doing what I do in churches, and I'm thinking that's probably the better place, because there are plenty of people, who are signing the dotted line. But I think she is a fabulous candidate. I'm not sure. I didn't expect to even be able to support somebody this good coming down the line, really. It was quite plausible to me that it would just never get better than what Obama was. And boy, that was problematic, how it came down. So more broadly, and now this is the Politico sort of speaking. It matters. It matters tremendously whether you are in a time in which mass movements exist or can even be imagined. We had mass movements in the 1960s, and then they were gone, and then we have generations come along. We got a generation that remembers what it was like, but is now is living in this space that just felt just mean and degraded by comparison, and it was demoralizing. And then it got worse. There was for people of my ilk and working in the kind of doing the kind of political stuff that I was doing, there was no period more demoralizing, more deflating than the entire 1990s. It was just utterly desperate, and there I didn't even bother to talk to students during that period about what a mass movement was or why it mattered, because it's just not even imaginable in that context. Now this is strictly the hang in there, try to find your faithful remnant, to hang in with something, in resistance. Because back then, even my friends are checking their stock options, and and getting feeling wealthy because of all the tech startups and all that was happening during that time. Where we had a Democratic president during that time, whose only passionate belief, the only thing that Bill Clinton in his whole presidency ever walked into rooms like this one and tried, if everyone had a different opinion, he would work to try to turn your mind. He would try to convince you there's only one thing, and that was neoliberalism, right? NAFTA. He was passionate and convictional, cared all the way down, and belief, and that's our guy. That's the Democratic Party signing on to neoliberalism. So they were both just fully Wall Street parties, then there's just no getting around it. To have come from that, to be now living in the time we're in now, where now there are mass movements bubbling up. And just little signs. I mentioned a bunch of them. Just the fact that I got a little outfit like DSA, Democratic Socialist America, was just 3 years ago. It was still like 4,000 people. It's skyrocketed to like 65,000 people right now and growing. Now they've got all the problems of the old left. About different kinds of Marxism and more radical than thou and all that it's been regurgitated because now it's big enough that these things actually mean something, and they do. But as I said, that's why I ended the way I did. I'd much rather be here, where maybe we're too late, because it is terribly late, But I'd much rather be active in a time when there are, in fact, not just the idea of there are mass movements burbling up, and so that can make all the difference in doing this work. That you're not just hanging out with a few people and having to wonder if you're crazy, for doing so. So, thank you, friends.